so many of these ergonomic keyboards basically decided, hey, you know what's not ergonomic? Reaching for keys.
Which is true.
Which is true.
It's not wrong.
But if you remove those keys, then you've replaced it with a new problem, which is now you've got to do weird hand stretching key combos to recreate. Like if you don't have an F7 key and instead you have to hit Control Shift 7 or something to do that, then that's probably worse, right?
Butterscotch shenanigans.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 429 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I have something in my eye.
I'm Sam and I like when Seth says the game dev comedy podcast because it's got a lot of good feeling crunchiness in it. The game dev comedy
it's bouncy.
Yeah.
It's got plosives and stuff. Now this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's August 18th, 20 Jubilee. Before we get started, we got a warning. There's going to be swears, curses, profanities in this episode. Yep. The other episodes are totally clean, so you can just go check all those out. Don't even worry about it. And skip past the intro, too. Don't even worry about it.
We just learned about profanity in between the last podcast and this one, so we're going to try it out.
We're going to do some test deployments of our new favorite words. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your monthly donations to help keep the podcast going. Now, here's the deal. We got just a couple of little things to talk about, and then we're going to hit some questions. So first thing I want to talk about is Stitch for VS Code. So Adam, take it away. What's Stitch?
So Stitch is our open sourced project. It's sort of a collection of tools for working on GameMaker projects, building pipelines. That's what we do for our pipeline and stuff. And then more recently, we've talked about this in the podcast a little while ago. I've been working on a Visual Studio Code, which is a code editor that people use for web dev and really anything because it's a cool open source, very extendable project.
VS Code for short.
Yeah, VS Code for short. It's a free thing by Microsoft. And it's great. So I use that for all of my web dev. But that's also where stuff like Copilot, which we've also talked about a lot in the past, comes in because Copilot is AI to help you program, and it is really good. And that lives in VS Code. And so we wanted to get access to that stuff. And so I'd been working on basically a VS Code extension to make it so we can actually work on GameMaker projects in VS Code so we can get access to Copilot and other cool tools. So we talked about this a little bit in the past, and so this is more of just to say, it's worth checking out again if it's something that you're interested in exploring, if you do GameMaker stuff and want to see what it's like to have Copilot or other tools at your disposal, or just to use an alternate editor. Stitch for VS Code is now, it can kind of do all of the stuff at this point. So in particular, all the code stuff. And so it doesn't have all the visual editors for sprites and that kind of stuff, and it's never going to. That's all stuff that's squarely gets to stay in GameMaker's wheelhouse. This is just about making it as easy as possible to navigate the code and to edit it. And it's just gotten into a really good spot as of this week where you can now fully manage your asset tree. You can reorganize everything. You can delete stuff. You can add new resources, right? So you can do all of that kind of stuff you'd want to be able to do. You can run your game right from VS Code as long as you have real GameMaker installed. You can just kind of do all of that stuff. But also your ability to kind of just navigate through the project and find stuff is just super reliable and super slick now, to the point where it was actually one of my major motivations for starting the project in the first place was that the GameMaker editor itself, the official one, it's just so hard to navigate the code. Like when I'm going to try to work on Seth's stuff, because almost the entirety of Crashlands 2 is written by Seth, right? If I'm trying to go in to figure something out and I'm using that editor, I just can't find anything. You can't start in one place and
find your way back.
Be like, oh, where is this thing defined? And go to that definition, or let me see all the references to this thing so I can figure out where it's used, and therefore try to figure out how this thing works, right? And so that was a lot of what I had tried to solve, and as of this week in particular, all the little kind of remaining jank is basically resolved. So it's pretty dope. I highly recommend giving it a shot.
Yeah, and if you're a game maker
Yeah, it's
dev, like a hobby dev or something like that, and you've been wanting to take it's basically, to me, it's a profession. It's like a professional layer on top, right? Where it allows you to do some stuff in a way that it opens access in an interesting way for more professional development and more kind of professional studio development to happen much more easily than like the base game maker experience. So
So in a weird way, so I've been using it a lot because I spend all day every day programming game maker stuff. And up until pretty recently, I was able to use Stitch in VS Code about half the time. And then at some point I would run into something like, oh, I need to create a new object, or I need to move this into a different folder or whatever. And we didn't have those features yet. So then I would have to open up the Game Maker IDE and do that stuff in there. And then, sometimes I would just stay in there because I wasn't sure if I was going to run into that again.
Mm-hmm.
But
because context switching is always annoying. Right?
Yeah. So, it was kind of like I would always start my day in VS Code. And earlier on, I could do maybe like an hour of stuff in VS Code before I would.
And then send me a list of issues.
Yeah. Start to run into missing features or whatever. And I'm kind of hitting the point now where I'd say about 90% of my programming time I can just do in Stitch and in VS Code. And it's only really when I'm doing like a lot of sprite work or audio stuff
that isn't code, basically.
Yeah, stuff that needs like these like more sophisticated editor, like visual editors and stuff like that. So it's coming on great. But the funniest thing is that we did this so we could get Copilot, right? Mm-hmm. Copilot is kind of interesting because it doesn't know GML, it knows JavaScript, and GML is similar to JavaScript, but it isn't.
Like
not
very
JavaScript.
similar, but there are some very important differences.
Yeah. And big thing is that, as the Game Maker language has thousands of built-in functions that do all kinds of things that JavaScript does not have.
Yeah. Or if it does, it has them in a different kind of a way, right?
Yeah. So for example, like if you want the length of a list of something in Game Maker language, you use the function called array length. Yeah. Which JavaScript doesn't have that function.
But in JavaScript, you can actually just there are variables that live on arrays. So you can you have an array and be like array dot length. So you just
length.
You just poke a hole into your array and ask for its length, right?
Yeah. Right, yeah. So it's the same concept, but each language has its own way of doing it, and Copilot doesn't know that. So what I basically found is that at the moment, Copilot is still pretty constrained, where it can see what you're currently working on, like in the current file that you're working on, and I think it can also see stuff that you have in other tabs, right?
Other open tabs are pulled into context. Yeah.
So basically, like if I have a bunch of tabs open, then Copilot will do a decent job of figuring out, like, oh, this isn't JavaScript. I want to get the length of this array or something. I'll use this array length function instead of dot length, right? But it doesn't know everything, right, about the whole project. It doesn't know all my variables and all that stuff. And so a lot of the times, Copilot just gives me like weird stuff that actually doesn't really work at all, or like doesn't fit. So it's still like it's way better than not having it, because a lot of, like sometimes it does just nail it,
and it's otherwise it's like a fancy autocomplete, right? Like like within the same file you're working on, it just does a really good job of like, oh, I've seen you use this variable a bunch of times in the same file. I'll just like, so you start typing it, it's like, oh, did you mean to do this whole thing?
And so it's pretty good with that. But the funny thing is like the killer feature actually that's like keeping me in VS Code more than anything is the ability to wiggle my mouse wheel to the left.
I know, right? To go forward and back. Yeah.
To go back to where I was before.
Oh. Yeah.
Right? Because like in Game Maker, like if I'm working on a script, I'm like, oh, I got to go check something else out. And then I go to a different function, and then, I got to go to a different function. And I'm doing all that because of what I started doing a while ago.
Yeah.
Being able to then just like hit a little back button and just have it pop me right back to where I was, like it's like that on its own is such an incredible feature.
Which this is what I was saying, right? Like it was the inability to navigate a project,
started the whole thing
in Game Maker. Yeah, that made it so frustrating. And that feature that you're talking about is the core one that made me so, because it's already hard to navigate projects in the Game Maker IDE,
or just any large code project,
large code base. Yeah, definitely. And so the tools available for navigation are actually the most important thing, in my opinion, as a project gets large. And that's the feature set that looks like the GameMaker IDE just like hasn't really invested into yet. I think their new code editor that they're working on, that I think they've pushed it out a bit, but I think by end of the year they're supposed to have that in alpha or beta or something to play with.
Stuff, yeah.
And I know a lot of the features that they're working on, they're kind of saving for the new code editor because they don't want to have to like make the features twice in two different systems and stuff. So I think a bunch of these things that we're talking about are going to be appearing in GameMaker in principle relatively soon, right? But it is those things like you just need that good navigation. And that was the thing that when I was trying to help Seth with something because for a very short window we were like, hey, maybe Adam should be working on some game code stuff to help Seth out, right? And I was like, yeah, the problem, of course, is just that this is all code that Seth has written. So I need to be able to like understand it.
You got to be able to walk around in here.
You got to be able to move around. And I just like, and so I would be like, oh, what is this doing? And I would be doing exactly that. I would like drill into something and then be like, okay, now that I know what this is,
let me go back to where I started.
To where I was. And now I'm like and I'm just like searching things again to try to find it.
Yeah. Where the fuck was I?
Yeah. And that was actually the thing that pushed me into, it was that exact experience that pushed me into trying to build a VS Code editor experience for GameMaker, because I was getting the cognitive load was so high for me trying to help in any way, and I was like, how hard is this really? Can we? And the answer is like pretty fucking hard. It's
pretty hard.
It's been a lot of hours of labor's gone into it.
Armchair dev, go.
Yeah, but it's pretty slick at this point. It is the case like now I feel like I'm flying through the code when I'm like trying to do stuff, you know. And it's actually an even worse experience when I open up the GameMaker IDE because in the interim, none of these features for navigation have been added to GameMaker. Right? Again, I think a bunch of them are being added to the eventual new code editor. And so as it becomes easier and easier to navigate the project outside, it just feels worse and worse to come back to the GameMaker IDE and not be able to do those things.
It seems like a very good plug for it, though. So again, it's open source; it's free. You can just get it in VS Code and then hook your projects up to it and start using it, and have just a better time doing code stuff in GameMaker.
Doing GameMaker, yeah, because you still need a GameMaker license. You still need, you still need to pay the GameMaker people and all of that stuff, right? So like,
and it doesn't do everything the GameMaker IDE does, right? Yeah. And it's not intended to. It's basically built to solve all of our use cases, right? And then specifically for code, nothing else. And I've gotten there are a bunch of people in the community using it. I've gotten really useful feedback from them, but also some things where I'm like, yeah, we're not going to be doing that thing because like technically, it's technically valid GML, but we don't do that, and it would be a pain in the ass to support it, so we just won't. So your mileage may vary depending on what kind of stuff that you're doing in your projects. But yeah, I mean, it works really well for Crashlands 2, right? Which is just an enormous project. I'm not sure if the last time we looked at lines of code on the thing, but it's just as an example, when I was testing, because I just yesterday I implemented all the like being able to rearrange stuff in the asset tree so you can like make new folders and
move around,
click, drag a whole bunch of things to a different folder or whatever. And so I just to experiment, because I have a little test project I use for stuff, right? But then before I ship stuff, I'm like, okay, let me open up Crashlands 2 and see what breaks. Because once you hit scale, things change, And I just took like 3 folders and then like clicked, multi-selected them and then dragged them into a different folder. And then everything kind of froze and then just kind of chugged along a bit, and then finally actually happened. Finally, like everything updated and it had moved. And then Git showed me that there were like 870 files that had changed or something, right? Just from me moving 3 folders, right?
Just grabbing 3 random folders.
Yeah, like that's the scale of shit that we're doing with Crashlands 2, and which I think is part of it too, is that the current GameMaker editor itself, like, is mostly tested and like really used and stuff by kind of medium to smaller projects. And there are a lot of these like issues that once you get into larger projects, that editor just isn't quite, it hasn't been designed for things of that scale, really.
Yeah.
Or is really more accurate, it's missing the features that you need once you hit that scale.
Yeah.
So
and of course, like if less than 1% of GameMaker customers need those features, I understand why they wouldn't prioritize
definitely
putting time into them. So, but yeah, so if you need that, Stitch for VS Code, just look you can just Google it, right? It's just you can.
If you just
look
Google
at in VS Code.
If you're in VS Code and you go to your extensions, you can just search for Stitch. It'll pop up.
It's like an icon with like a little purple
little like zombie head kind of.
It's a little voodoo doll with the threads shoved through it.
Being stitched together.
Yep.
So then the other kind of interesting thing that happened this week. Well, I mean, of course, a million interesting things happen, but we only got so much time, right? So
and a lot of it's only interesting with infinite context, you know. So.
So Baldur's Gate, which we talked about last week, great game. I'm still playing it. I don't even know I'm like 20 hours in. I don't actually know how far in I am percentage wise. I don't know if I'm like halfway through or 3%. I have no idea. But I'm having a great time. So Larian Studio, the company that made Baldur's Gate, they put out a hotfix a couple days ago.
Ooh.
This is their 4th hotfix. And
when did they launch?
A few weeks ago, I think.
So for
maybe two or 3 weeks ago.
So they've been launching like a hotfix twice a week, almost
few days.
every day.
Yeah, and for the most part, these hotfixes contain 200 or 300 bug fixes, crash fixes, just like issues where like a spell just doesn't work as described, or whatever. Like it just as a term that Adam used, micro jank, which I love, which is like they're just like fixing micro jank, just all these little things that kind of aren't working very well. So in their latest hotfix, they actually accidentally deployed a bunch of new crashes into the game. So it was a hot garbage, hot mess. So they deployed it, and immediately players started reporting, oh my God, like my game's crashing all the time, blah, blah, blah. And so after a few hours, they rolled it back. So they deployed a new version of the game they essentially just reverted it. So what you can do on Steam, for example, is like you can just like choose which version of your game is the one that people have access to. Mm-hmm. And there's a big problem with game versioning that I think a lot of players probably haven't thought much about, or like don't, like have the context to recognize like how this kind of works, which is that whenever you increment the version number of a game, what that really means is that you've changed the way the code works.
Yeah, you've changed something, right?
You've changed something.
Something behaves differently now.
Yeah, and what that can also mean from time to time is that whenever you save data from the games, like you've played and you've got your save that you want to load, that may mean that something has changed in that save file that kind of thing didn't used to be there. So it's like maybe there's like a new variable that's stored in there, or there's some new stuff, or there's like whatever it is. Or maybe even like some new items were added to the game that didn't exist before, and then when you save them into your save file, they're in there now. Mm-hmm. Well, if you revert back to a lower version, that lower version doesn't know how to read that stuff in the save file. It doesn't know what those items are, or it would read things out of order, or whatever the case may be.
So you essentially have a corrupted file because the game is like, what the fuck what are these things? I don't know what these are. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that means that in this case, those any players who played the game for during that few hour window and saved at any point, those saves can no longer be loaded. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So presumably until a new hotfix goes out that has a higher version number.
Yes. Well, basically they're gonna redo the patch, figure out those crashes, and then redeploy it. Right. Yeah. And so what I thought was really interesting was that I've seen studios kind of like botch deployments before. It happens.
Especially if you're operating at this scale, with both the scale of the game and the scale of the player base. Like that's going to be a very, like, I would be sweating every time we deployed something, because you cannot test enough when you have that level of scale, right?
I'm also actually surprised, kind of on that note, because they were in early access for a long time, right? Yeah. And kind of like us with Levelhead, they had figured out how to deploy updates quickly, right? So, because I'm really surprised they already put out 4 hotfixes in production because this is not early access.
That's great.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, people are not signed up for the chaotic kind of experience that early access is supposed to be for. and being able to roll out, 2 updates a week or whatever for a production game and have high confidence with this many players downstream and have confidence that you're not going to break something is
apparently they don't quite have that high confidence. They have.
But I wonder if
they
it's
have medium confidence.
I wonder if it's because they haven't like fully made like that kind of a switch from the early access way of doing things to the post-launch way of doing things,
Right, with a little bit more like more testing, a little bit more time between patches and stuff like that.
Yep.
And it's also kind of tough because like with as many developers as they have, the idea of small batch. We've talked about small batch delivery before, where it's basically like if you change one thing and deploy a patch and then the game starts crashing, you know exactly why the game is crashing. And it's because of the one thing you did, right? If you have 500 things in a patch and the game starts crashing, well, have fun.
Yeah.
Have fun doing archaeology and excavating and figuring out how the fuck that happened because you got to go through every change and narrow it down. Well, in their case, the game is so big and they have so many developers that even if they're putting out a patch every few days, that patch has hundreds and hundreds of changes in it. So they're a large studio. It's a big game.
Really together.
Yeah, everything's big.
Yeah.
And so
I'm just thinking about that because this is actually something that always blows my mind when I hear about like large web companies that have a similar thing, right? Where they've got hundreds or thousands of people who are all basically working on kind of separate things, then committing their changes into a centralized system that then does all the automated testing and all that stuff, right? That's the integration step in these automated pipelines. And integration is always the most challenging thing for exactly this reason, which is you're introducing changes from various sort of locations into one place. Some of that is also really hard to appreciate because it doesn't happen at small scale, but it starts happening at large scale, is the idea of what it even means for a version to exist, right? Because a version is just a snapshot of changes that have been made in a linear sequence of changes, right? But when a bunch of people are just like kind of throwing changes together using a version control system that allows things to be kind of out of order actually, because it just kind of makes it work, which is how all of them work because they have to handle that kind of scale. Then at any given moment of time, like what does it mean? So it's like, so if you're a Larian, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're a Larian and you're like, okay, we've got our milestone, we've got a whole bunch of bugs we want to fix, right? So we have 30 different people all working on bugs, all making commits into this thing, right? And we've run it through our automated test suite and, like whatever, right? But what state do we stop at and say, okay, we're going to release this thing, right? Mm-hmm. And then that now goes through testing, right? Through like human testing and like the release starts going through the release process, goes through localization, like all that kind of stuff, right? While that's happening, everybody didn't stop working on stuff, right? So now like the trunk, right? People are still submitting things to it. And when you're operating at this scale, the next time you go look at that branch, like a day has gone by and there's like 500 changes or whatever, right? So now if something has gone wrong on your release branch, right? Where you basically tried to freeze everything and say like, okay, we need to know what's happening so we can test it, make sure it's stable before we get it out. So we have to stop making changes. So you fork it off, right? And you kind of hold that thing as static as you can while you make sure you can launch it. But if something goes wrong, and we dealt with this at our scale, it's a huge fucking nightmare just for a few people working on it. Then how do you address it? Because the fix is probably somewhere in the 500 changes that have happened on the trunk in between. But if you bring all of those changes in, you're just starting back over completely.
Yeah,
right?
you might introduce a new crash, right?
Yeah. It's a hard challenge.
Yeah, we always talk about like game data loss being the most terrifying thing for us on the dev side. Because like as far as the one of the commitments that you're really trying to offer to the player base is that you're not going to waste their fucking time, right? That's kind of like that's the whole gambit from top to bottom. Whether it's look at this box art, it means that you're not going to waste your time by playing this game. Like look at this trailer, you're not going to waste your time, and then to have the person invest their time and then destroy it in like a Thanos snap because of some corruption or whatever else is just the grossest. Like it just feels the worst.
So here's what was interesting. This is where we've talked a lot in the past about the idea that like many things that seem just like they are what they are actually entirely dictated by structural elements around them that make them be the way that they are. Mm-hmm. So like the idea of like gamer communities being like angry and toxic or whatever. Not necessarily true. It really depends on the game and how the game works. And So, for example, if you have a game that's built on FOMO, the fear of missing out, like a seasonal game with battle passes or some shit, and every single day that somebody doesn't play that game is a big problem, right? And then your servers go down for a day, right? Your community will be mad as fuck because you've made the game such that you're kind of obligated to keep uptime, right? Like that's just how the game works. In the case of Baldur's Gate, it's largely a single player game. It has multiplayer, right? But like most people are playing it single player. So, and also like your save will still be there when they redeploy the hotfix, right? So
also,
you'll
save
get
like constantly, right? And it doesn't overwrite.
Yeah.
It just like shows.
Yeah, you got like a certain number of saves that like 20. You can change this in the settings, but every time you quick save or save, then it adds that save to a list, so you can always go back to an older save. So, and on top of that, the game is branching enough that it's really fun to start a new save.
Interesting. Right.
And so the community response was like, oh, well. And that was the whole thing. Because people are like, yeah, I'll just wait. I'll wait for the hotfix. Or they'll be like, oh, perfect. I'm wanting to start a new character anyways, so I'll just do that, or whatever. But there was just like, the basic response was, honestly, this game is so good and it's so big. Honestly, I can't even figure out how you guys are deploying hotfixes this fast anyways.
Yeah.
So
it was essentially saying
mad.
there's no loss to my time here because actually I'll just go play the game slightly differently and have a different, also rad as fuck experience, and that's fine by me. Is that essentially?
This is the same idea that we talked about as being like one of the core concepts in the Crashlands 2's design is that because this is an accessibility thing, right? It's basically an accessibility in the very general sense of like can people approach it how they want to or can, right? And when a game has lots of ways for you to interact with it, it sort of just creates this inherently. Because so like with Crashlands 2, we have always been talking about the design. Like, what if the player runs into something that they just like can't figure out right now, or they like run up against a boss fight, they just can't beat that boss, right? Or they're trying to craft something and it's just like taking forever, right, to get all the ingredients or something, right? If that's the only thing you can be doing right now, that's the stuff that kicks people out of games. And the same deal, like if you're playing a game and all of a sudden you can't continue your save that you left off because the game is temporarily broken or the web service went down or whatever, right? Like there's nothing for you to do now. You're just stuck, right? And so that's what kicks people out of games. But as soon as there's just something else you can go do, so that doesn't feel worse, right? Yeah. Then you can absorb a lot of design flaws actually by just having more stuff to do. You can sort of manage a lot of balance issues in the same way, right? Because it's really hard to balance a game. Actually, it's impossible to balance a game because the concept doesn't exist actually, because every player comes to a game needing something different from like what the balance even means, right? So there's no such thing as a balanced game, right? And so one of the ways you can mitigate that is by just having lots of stuff to do so that the player can just go do something else when they run into a hurdle, right? And if that something else allows them to come back to that hurdle later somehow different, then again, you can kind of mitigate these things. Yeah. And so I think this is just an example of that, right? Where it's like, because of the way the save system works, where you can save as you go, you can go back to any save at any time. And presumably they must have designed it so that when you boot up the game with a new version, it doesn't sort of upgrade all the saves it finds. It only does it to the ones you play, right? Which is actually an interesting thing because like, that's one of those little things where if you didn't think about that, then the more natural thing would be like, oh, we're in a new version of the game. Let's make sure all of this, like the existing saves are compatible. So you would like run some check and upgrade them or whatever, right? But the moment you do, because now also the gap between every new version and what version all the saves are and stuff stays really small. Just keeps versus growing, right? And so, but by not doing that, it means that if they do have to down version at some point, then
you got some safety.
You got some saves that are compatible still, right? So there's always like, I don't know if you guys remember, but this is back when we were in the office still working on Levelhead. We were at a whiteboard for hours trying to figure out how to handle our
versioning problem,
versioning strategy. And there's a whole bunch of components to it. So it wasn't just like we solved it and we were done. It was like, every angle of how to handle this stuff we had to like tackle. And each time we did, it was like a day of work trying to figure out all of the consequences of the choices that we could make, you know? It's hard.
It's complicated as fuck. And so, but I mean, I thought it was really great to see that like because of the way the game is made and also because I feel like also the player community is in a honeymoon phase.
Yeah, they got goodwill to burn, right? For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, all right, well, you know, with all the good that this game has brought into people's lives, it's all right for there to be like a little fuck up like this. It's like such a small thing. And like you said, people have options. They've got other things they can do. What I was laughing though, because quite a few of the comments on like the Reddit thread that popped up about this in the Baldur's Gate subreddit was basically like people kind of like play acting as if they were upset because now they have to like go see the sun for the first time in 3 weeks or like, so it was like, oh, what am I going to do tonight now? Spend time with my family? For fuck's sake, you know? And so it's like, yeah, it's nice to see a community that's just like so pumped and they're like forgiving because they're just so excited to have the thing that sometimes it doesn't work out, you know?
Yeah. But like you said, it works because of this huge combination of factors, right?
Yeah.
The design of the game, the history of the game, the kind of game it is, the audience that was generated, and also like a huge fraction of the audience comes from tabletop RPGs, right? And that audience is like really accustomed to chaos, right? Because that's such
scheduling problems, and like random bullshit.
and also it's a relatively forgiving audience because it's all about people, right? For like in the TTRPG space. So yeah, there's a lot going for it to allow it to have that. And I don't know how much of it is by design versus just, you know, sort of a incidental consequence of just all of the history of decisions that were made, you know?
Yeah. All right, well, let's get on to some questions. Our questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net. Highest upvoted question comes from, I think this is ModernWizard maybe, but the M is missing, so it's just ODernWizard. I don't know if that,
nice.
I don't know what that means.
It's an ODernWizard.
Darn it.
It says, a few episodes back, you discussed your ZSA Moonlander keyboards.
Oh, yeah.
Having had more time to work with them and adjust, have you grown to love them, or do you have some buyer's remorse? I was considering making the leap, but would appreciate the insight.
I don't use mine because turns out that having to relearn an entire keyboard was just very annoying. Even if after playing with it for a bit, I was like, I could see that if I somehow was able to surmount this hurdle, that it would be great.
Of basically not being able to type for like a month.
Yeah, but that's a hard sell for me, especially for where I'm at life-wise. We got a baby and stuff because this is usually stuff that I would do if I was like, oh yeah, I got this new piece of tech. I'm gonna go spend some hours on it. You know,
just gotta dunk 20 hours into it,
just casually. Yeah, and I'm like, no, I don't have time for that shit. So yeah, I don't use mine. I just use a split. I got a different split keyboard, but it's just a keyboard. You know.
Yeah. My wife still uses hers really. Like just absolutely. So, which I'll say because I'm about to also say that I don't use mine anymore. But there are definitely people out there, and I think on our team, uses his, and he's been doing some fun, cool, weird stuff with it too. With like he's using it as a mouse now, I guess, and some other stuff, right? So like Sam said, depending on your willingness to dedicate the time, the payoff I think is there. I think that's true.
Yeah, definitely.
I think for me, it was a similar kind of a deal where like I spent 6 weeks, I think, on it, something like that. And I got to the point where I was typing regular speed and like all that kind of stuff, right? But it was still the case that for like programming and for navigation, their decision to remove because there's no F keys, right? And there's no
escape key.
That's true. There's no escape key. Like those keys are gone. That row is gone. And then also
bearing in mind you can rebind any key to anything.
You can rebind anything to anything. But in terms of number of keys, like the F keys aren't there, and then the two sort of rightmost columns that on a normal keyboard have like backspace and pipe and enter and stuff, right? And then like the one key adjacent to that are also gone in terms of number of keys. And
then no numpad, no arrow keys.
No numpad, no arrows, and that kind of stuff.
So, none of that entire right.
So chunk. to get the full set of functionality, you have to relearn so many things because the F keys now have to exist somewhere, so they have to be mapped onto something. All of those right hand keys have to go somewhere. The escape key, like everything has to go somewhere. And what I found was that there were too few keys. Like they'd removed too much for me as a programmer. Because I'm using all the F keys. I'm using every fucking character. I'm using everything on the whole keyboard.
Using the arrow keys.
I'm using everything all the time.
Yep.
And I just couldn't find a way to overload the smaller set of keys that my brain could just like keep track of and my fingers felt good doing, you know? And again, I was getting better at it, and I had settled on a key binding that was pretty good, but it was just still the case that I just was frustrated kind of constantly at a low level. So I got a new keyboard. But right before we got the Moonlander, I had splurged on with my own money, because the Moonlanders we just bought with studio money, because we're like, this is, ergonomic stuff for people, right? But before that, I had splurged on this Keychron keyboard. That's a 10 keyless, like the 70%, whatever they call them. But the 10 keyless keyboard, because I like that smaller space, because the mouse closer, all that stuff. And I love that thing. It was just so heavy and like felt so good to type on, And I wanted that again, but having used the Moonlander, I was like, I need that split keyboard though, because now
that's the way to go.
It's just so much better. So
yep.
So I've replaced it with a fancy Keychron split, because they just released a split keyboard. I think it's the Q11, I think. But so I basically got that thing instead. So I still get that, like, it's a really good feeling keyboard, and I really like it. But it's back to just a regular ass keyboard, and it took about a week to kind of like be able to use the regular keyboard again, But now I just feel like I'm flying. It feels so good again. It was like a breath of fresh air after trying to use the Moonlander for 6 weeks.
I think
that's what we kind of learned is like, Yeah. It depends on your use case. So many of these ergonomic keyboards basically decided, hey, you know what's not ergonomic? Reaching for keys.
Which is true.
Which is true.
It's not wrong.
But if you remove those keys, then you've replaced it with a new problem, which is now you've got to do weird like hand stretching key combos to like recreate. Like if you don't have like an F7 key, and instead you have to like hit like Control Shift 7 or something to do that, then that's probably worse.
And then and especially though, if you're using something like VS Code, which we just talked about earlier, right? But like VS Code, if you ever pop open its key bindings options, so you can like go edit your hotkeys and stuff. The sheer fucking number of things that do stuff,
trillions.
And so that's the other thing too, is like to be able to then overlap sort of behavior on keys by reprogramming stuff and not conflict with other things that you need to do. It's one of those that it's like I think since my wife mostly, she doesn't code, she writes a lot, but it's all prose, right? And she loves it. I think it's one of those things where I feel like if I was writing like text, if I was an author, right? And I didn't need all of the fucking symbols and the F keys like constantly all the time. I think that's where I would really love something like the Moonlander.
Well, it's also, I think it speaks to an interesting interaction between some parts of the expertise that you developed, right? In terms of timing, which is like if you had developed expertise on the Moonlander before basically knowing and rehearsing and using all of the hotkeys within some VS Code.
Right. Yeah. Because then you're
that
adding
hits at a very different time. Yep. That's a very different thing. And it probably would just be better because it it allows you to feel like you're just typing faster, which is kind of what you get out of it. But I think to the extent that you've already developed a lot of expertise in a particular way of using the keyboard, making what seems like optimal changes sort of like locally to a keyboard setup can probably interfere with enough of those. I think it's also the experience I had because, of course, I've talked about my left hand having 128 keybinds on it for Clip Studio Paint and Spine and stuff. Just the left side of the keyboard, right? Which, that was a problem when I was working on the Moonlander because it was trying to figure out again how to put. It was just so many layers that I've already gone into layering stuff into that side of the keyboard and then missing some keys and having to go back in and add. There's like a whole fucking thing there that I think was too much. So it may have just arrived at the wrong time for us, frankly, in terms of making it easy to adopt.
Yeah, I think if you haven't done if you had fewer needs for the sheer number of keys, that's what was your starting point. Yeah. I think you're right that it would be because being able just to add things one at a time, because I've been struggling with it, and I'm sure that Seth was having too, is like in particular, like on your right pinky is like its job is to do like all of the most important special characters that are used for programming. It's like the pipe and the brackets and like all this stuff, right? And they just aren't fucking there, right? And so it was just like every single
Yeah,
key.
you basically, it forces like intense relearning because you basically have to redecide how you want to hit those keys. How do you
and the arrow keys?
Yeah, and the arrow
and the
keys.
arrow keys. Yep.
Yeah, I couldn't quite get.
I want my
figured
keys.
out, unfortunately, but I wish I could.
Well, I mean,
That's very cool.
I feel like I could, but yeah, just like you said, when we're actively trying to like develop this game, we have a small team, right? So like, if any one of us suddenly is like at 1/3 capacity for a month, all of us are at 1/3 capacity for that month because we're all interdependent on each other.
But I mean, we do talk a lot about like being able to take the time to go fast, right? I just think it's the sort of thing where I think the reality is, given the level of investment all of us have already put into very specific tool use cases for our keyboards, I think it's just the sort of thing that like that tool, the Moonlander, is like actually has a harder time making us go fast, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It was to make us go safe. It's ergonomics, right?
Yeah.
We weren't necessarily going to be like typing faster because of it, right? It was just
I do think that if the Moonlander had, honestly, if it just had more keys, and the weird thing is like the place where they added keys is like
In the middle, I'll get
in
it.
the middle.
Yep.
It's more,
Yep.
which is like, and I can see how maybe that makes better ergonomic sense, maybe, but the fact is like my hands are trained to, like to
Go out.
to go out and otherwise keep my hands like not moving from the middle and then like to go outward if I need to. And now having going like in and out, actually now just in instead of out.
Yeah.
Which
instead
again,
of your pinky finger reaching out, your index finger has to reach inward.
yeah,
which
probably
is different.
ergonomically better. I think that's probably true.
Definitely, yeah.
But if they, I don't even care they added those keys there. If they just had also still had
The other
one
ones.
extra fucking column
yeah.
and one extra row, then like, I honestly, I think that would have been, because then it would just be like basically the keyboard again, right? Except
it's a
ortholinear, so everything's in a column instead of kind of staggered, right? But it would just been like a regular keyboard with some cool features, like the cool, like, because then the thumb thing would be really interesting instead of
The
like
thumb thing
how
is
I
fucking
fit.
great. That's the
It's
truth
cool.
too. It's
Yeah.
really good. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, how do you fit enough things onto there, and like,
Tricky.
yeah, I think if you were able to start with like, I still have basically all of my keys, so I can start with like a regular key binding, right?
And then gradually.
But now ortholinear and now split keyboard, and then with this cool thumb pad, right? And then now you can make decisions one at a time incrementally to like, ooh, now that I can, let me move this key over here and see how that works or whatever. And then over years, because the way that you normally like learn all this stuff is over years, right? Like you learn your original touch typing over like months in school and then over years of practice, right? And then for each new thing that you add, like being able to quickly hit the plus button or something, right? Or the right F key for a new hotkey or something like that. Like you learn that just by doing it a bunch of times. And if you have to do that with 20 keys all of a sudden, right?
Yeah.
It's a big ask.
Yeah. Yep.
It was a thing. So yeah, if you're not a programmer, maybe, but otherwise, I don't know. Maybe look somewhere else.
I think it's one of those love-hate things. Like the people who invest the time and have the right kind of use case seem to kind of just universally love the Moonlander. Yep. But those who can't invest the time or whose use cases make us that the just sheer amount of time they have to invest
It's way higher.
is really high. That's where I think, but I think it's still the case. Like everybody wants to love it though, because it is like a cool concept.
You can tell. You could tell that
great
it would
keyboard.
be better. That's the thing. It would be better if I could just like wave a fucking wand and somehow just have it in my brain. Yes, I would take it over a keyboard any day of the week. But like it just
has too few keys. Yeah, so I'm a big fan these days of, because I still like that constrained space and I need that split keyboard. I'm a big fan of like the 10 keyless. Everything is kind of like having the arrow keys kind of bumped, like pushed up into the rest of the keys, so that you just don't have to move your hands that much. And so, so if you're looking for a cool split keyboard that feels really good, I do recommend that Keychron. I think it's the Q11, but they only have one split keyboard right now. So, and it's got two little knobs too, like little twisty knobs in the corners. I don't know what to do with them because like there's nothing I need to use it, but you can bind them to stuff, right? So you can you could use them on your lights, or you could just do whatever with them. Again,
that is true. I was
don't know
also
what to do with
missing I was missing my media keys on the Moonlander of like having a volume knob and a mute, which like the thing is, again, you can code it up so that you can like flip into a different layer and hit those, but you still have to memorize their positioning and all. Yeah, so it's just,
You can't just go grab a knob, which is
can't just go twist a knob and be like, I want this to be quieter, knob. you know. All right. Next question comes from FlyhoppieAxerompa, who says, many episodes ago, Adam said something along the lines of, the best games have a quality mini game in them. Which was in reference to Cult of the Lambs minigame, which was quite good. A few episodes later, Seth made an unrelated comment about how he would love to work on a side project, but doesn't want to do it without all the Butterscotch tools, like cake frames and stuff. Seth, have you considered making your own minigame within Crashlands 2? I don't think I need to.
Yeah. Crashlands 2 is and it's already a whole bunch of minigames in a sense,
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, like, again, integration is the problem. Like, yeah, I could make chess or some bullshit, right? But then, like, where does it go? Like, when does the player come across it? Does it mean anything? Like, is it consequentially
Do you
tied
get
to
something? Is there a ranking attached to it? Do you get cards? Is it like Gwent? Do I collect cards from random peasants for some reason? Like, what's the mechanism by which I play it? Yeah, I think Cult of the Lamb has a interesting approach because they have basically a dice game that you can play with some of the characters, right? And there's some stuff, there's like some artifacts that you can win from beating each of the characters once. And then otherwise you just couldn't, it's like a gambling game. You can make money, right? And money is useful everywhere across the whole game. We've talked about this before, we don't have a currency in Crashlands 2. So there's no universal exchange mechanism that would make something like that easy to integrate, if that makes sense. Where you can just say like, we'll put whatever we want in there and then it spits out money. And we'll balance how much money it spits. I mean, that's it.
It would be interesting to like impacts story, or it could be like an in-universe game that just like the people of this world tend to know, right? So that it's something that you can do and you can like play against people and it has some kind of a consequence. Like they might give you a
you'd have
item,
like you basically have like recipes in that track or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But then you got to go do all that, too.
Which isn't to say we won't do it because we've still got quite a bit of development time, But it's not like you can just make a mini game and then just like put it in there. It's got to somehow cohere into the collective whole. I think an interesting example of this is that World of Warcraft has pet battles.
Yeah.
Which so basically like the game was full of these critters like squirrels and rabbits and and they're all just like
essentially.
Yeah, they're just like level 1 mobs that walk around and they have like 1 HP, and if you just for whatever reason blast them with a fireball or something, they're just like meh, and they just die, right? So like they're just there for atmosphere and just to have something to blast for fun. I don't know. And then I think it was maybe like 3 or 4 expansions into the game's existence. They ended up at a certain point, they had like hundreds and hundreds of these different critters. And they were like, we got to do something with these. So they essentially made a Pokemon style thing where like you can capture them and then train them and battle them with each other. And they have different types. There's like magic types and dragon types, and just like Pokemon, some have like bonuses or resistances, and they've got move sets and they level up. And nowadays, I think there's like several thousand different pets in this pet battling. It's like it's bigger than Pokemon in terms of like how many things there are in it. But it's so different from every other thing in the game. Like it's a turn-based battle that has absolutely nothing to do with your character, your gear, your raiding.
It's a self-enclosed system. You know what I mean?
And so as a result, you have like people who are really into the pet battles and do them all the time, and people who absolutely don't give a shit about them, right? Because it's just a whole different game within the game. And so every now and then there'll be these like events or whatever, these like maybe it's like you're trying to get like reputation with a faction, and there's all kinds of different ways to do it. And then every now and then like a little pet battle quest will appear. And if you do that pet battle quest, you'll get some stuff, you'll get some reputation, or whatever. And there's a portion of people like somewhere in the middle of the Venn diagram where like they don't give a shit about pet battling and they don't like it and they don't want to do it.
They want to do all the quests,
but they do it because it's integrated into these other systems in some ways. I think that's kind of weird. I don't know. it's
But I
hard
think
to.
but I think that's where it's again where it's like that it adds to the. And I think maybe if we kind of zoom out a bit to this concept, right, and think of it's less about like a mini game in the sense of like a fully enclosed thing. I think it's more about something to do that's basically just for funsies, as in like games are already just for funsies, right? Except that the way that they create fun is through reward and challenge systems, right? And as soon as you have like a reward system or a progression system tied to some part of the game, and as soon as like that's the point of the game, right? Then it's less of like, oh, you're doing this just because you can, right? Or just because you like it. There's this other stuff kind of pulling you through. And when it comes to these other things, because like Fallout New Vegas also had a card game, right? Or at least had cards. I don't even because I literally never tried to play it. Right?
They did have a card game.
Yeah, like because you could like collect cards as you go, and I'm pretty sure I vaguely remember people like one of the options I could always have with a lot of characters was to like play the game with them or something, you know. But again, I could be misremembering that because I just remember there were cards that you could collect and people would talk about some game. But I never played it because similar, like I didn't care, you know. But I thought it was kind of like I was like, oh, this is neat that there's just like this kind of thing you can just go do, you know. You don't need to. I don't even know if there's a reason to besides like a collector sort of thing, you know?
Well, it just gives you, like I think we were talking about earlier with Baldur's Gate, like having just, you would rather players if they're getting a little bored of whatever the content is or a little burned out by it, whatever, you know, because you could overindulge on a game systems. You'll feel it, you know. You'd rather have them stay within the game world for a while taking a break than go play something else because of the unhooking problem there, right? Which is like...
This is how I see fishing actually in a lot of games. It's like, to me, fishing is like that mini game staple where it's often like a little bit, it is like hooked into the rest of the game typically in some extent, but it's almost always in this like really light touch kind of optional way so that if you don't do it at all, it's probably fine. And it's one of those things where it's like, it just adds this layer where like when you walk by a body of water and if there's not something you need to be doing or want to be doing right now, but you don't really want to leave the game, it's just so easy just go fishing a little bit. Like in Terraria, I do a lot of fishing just because I can, you know, and I catch bugs. Like I just love like as I'm like flying through exploring spaces, right? And I got like my bug net's one of the first things to invest in. And I just like try to catch every bug, you know, just like swinging the net, catching things, you know, and like have like my bug collection. And then they add these other layers to it where you have like your terrariums you can build and stuff, right? Which don't do anything. It's just like,
it's just fun.
It's just fun that you can do that, right?
Yeah. I think having those systems in the game that let there be a bit of a reprieve from the overall, you know, primary purpose of you playing is just nice. So they don't need to fit super well, you know, frankly.
I think that's fair. But also like that's the entire MO of what we're doing in Crashlands 2 is like we're trying to we're working on this game that has a variety of levels of involvement. Yeah. Right. Like you can go out of your way and do like intense combat things. You can kind of sneak past stuff and like just do some casual harvesting. You can spend some time like working on your base. You can fish, you can farm, you can work on your pet stuff. Right.
Shit, if you don't really want to do combat, you could probably, I think, actually progress just by training bigger monsters into lower level areas, making them murder everything, and then hoovering up scraps like some weird vulture. You know, pretty sure you can.
Use the environment to destroy the environment. You know, and so there's all these different. There's a lot of different modes you can operate in. So then the idea of like mixing in an additional mini game into there, it kind of seems almost redundant at that point. You know. So.
Yeah, that's exactly. But I think that's why I think about it more like just conceptually is like there's one. So one part is like having lots of connected systems, but that allow you to kind of move between systems however you want, right? And where none of them are strictly a thing you have to. And so like that's where kind of Crashlands 2 is going at. And I think that absorbs a lot of that kind of big picture goal of something like this.
Yeah.
But I think there's another one though that I think of that I seems to be more kind of what the question asker is getting at is the frivolous one. Like that doesn't really do anything towards your main game goals, you know? But also the concept of a game, like, you know, calling it a mini game, I would just rephrase it as like something to do that at least some people find fun, right? And so like kind of going back to the Terraria thing, one of the things that I want to have in Crashlands 2, I don't know if we'll do it or not, but is because we have like little critters in the game. They don't do anything. They're just little critters that are like
they do stuff. You can catch them now and turn them into fish bait.
Oh, can you catch them now? Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's new. Yeah, so now you can use them for fishing, right? But also like I want to put them in a terrarium. Because like the moment that I can do that in Crashlands 2, right? Part of my new way of playing the game would be critter collection. I would basically make a shrine. I would have like, here's all the critters that I've caught, because now, and if it had no outcome besides that I got to be like, literally all we had is like a terrarium. You can put a thing in it. You can just watch it moving around. Right. Again, basically like Terraria does. Like if that's all we had implemented, that would create this entire new pointless minigame experience that I would just fucking love, right? And to me, like that's more of what this is kind of getting at. Is well, like that's that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, that to me kind of just comes back to like the base building idea, right? Of like back in the first game, we had like taxidermied creatures you could create, or like boss trophies you could get, and you could like make gold floors and make farms and do all this stuff, and it's 99% cosmetic stuff.
Yep.
Right. And every now and then there'd be like maybe a firework launcher that you could slap and it'll shoot fireworks or something. But for the most part, it's just stuff that just kind of looked a certain way, and then you used it to make an interesting like cosmetic scene for yourself. And so even just it's like what you're describing there is kind of like it's just that. Right. With like an interesting mechanism of like getting the creatures and stuff, and then like building your little terrarium, and then you just got this little like you get this little room with your creatures.
Well, and it's different because I don't really care much about base building, but I love creatures, right? So it's that kind of fun intersection of those two things where it's like in the end it's just you're right, it's just base building, right? But adding that layer now of like, and especially because in Terraria you can get a fancier bug net, and they're depending on where you go, there's just different kinds of bugs, and they have different bait power, which presumably sounds like we're doing too. But then also like having that be part of like why I go out and explore, because I'm like, I haven't filled out my cabinet of curiosities yet, like
gives you something else to be excited about, out in the game world, which is awesome.
Yeah. So there's tons of that already. And of course, as we're working on the game over the next big chunk of time, there'll be even more of that stuff. So,
and I think I still kind of agree with the original premise of what we were talking about at the time. It sounds like, which is that the really great games have that kind of stuff. Because those are things that you add because you can, right?
That's true.
So it's kind of like a signal of like the studio is like able to, like people are able to work on stuff because they like it, because they want to.
Because it's just fun. It's like, it'd be cool if we had X, and then they can just do that.
Yeah, they can just do it, and then the downstream consequence on the players is that there's just a lot of stuff going on that they get to choose.
Just saying a mini game is actually a consequence of a studio having either like a lot of resources or good development practices. And either of those things can result in a good game overall. Yeah. They don't it's not guaranteed, right? But like it helps. So
yeah, it's kind of like when I got a fancy vape pen a while ago. And it's got like little LEDs on it to kind of tell you if it's like heating up or whatever, right? But also, it's got a little gyroscope in there because it uses that to decide like, oh, have I been picked up? So I need to start heating back up again. Like clever, like cool little physical design, right? But they had that stuff in there where they were just like, well, we already have these lights. There's 4 little lights, and there's a gyroscope. So let's just put some games on this, right? So they have like a little Simon Says game where it'll like light up on one side and you have to tilt it to that side, right? Like absolutely no reason to have this in here. But I was, and I only played it once because like who needs that, right? But I was tickled pink by the idea that, and that to me that like that actually sold this device on a level that I wasn't already bought into, because I was like, the only reason to do this is because people were allowed to do something they thought would be fun, right? And they were invested in this.
Yeah, I like that idea of outcome, it's a green flag, right? Where it's a sign that there's excess or there's some slack available.
It's a sign of slack.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's like a heated seat in a car, You don't need it, but the fact that it's there, it's like, that's a nice little perk.
And it then just is also nice because now there's more stuff for the player to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye.